Hey guys, welcome back to our Elm Rust Dual Project API series. My name is Tensor. Today we're going to be implementing a post and delete method into our Elm application. So the reason why we're not going to do update or get by ID is mainly because it's a lot of repetitive coding, and delete and post should give you enough of an idea of how to do the other two if you really want to add them. As with any application in Elm, we want to think about our data first. More specifically, we want to change our type alias book record by adding an ID of int, and then our type alias model by adding a title, author, published, and error message field. So title and author and error message are all strings, and published is a boolean. Now this may seem a little weird. You may be wondering why I didn't just put a book into the model and why I exposed title, author, and published. Doing something like this is actually deceptively hard to deal with. When you want to update a record inside of Elm, you do something like this. You say like model, and then you want to update, say, the book field. You can't just say book.title and then update the book title attribute inside of your model. It doesn't work that way, and actually it's kind of awkward to do it that way. So it's actually easier for us to just embed the title, author, published inside of our model instead. And this error message is mainly for the error messages that we get back from encoding and decoding our JSON, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we get to it. Now, of course, with this new ID added into our book and with these new fields inside of our model, we need to update our init function. We want our init function to start with all of the default values for each of our fields. Our books will have an empty list inside of them. Our title will be an empty string. Our author will also be an empty string. Our published will be false, and our error message will also be an empty string. We also want to go down to our book decoder function and add the ID to our JSON decoder. So we just change this from map 3 to map 4, and then we add JSON at ID JSON int because it's an integer, and then this should now remove the error that we had before. With our data fixed and all of our functions working properly, we now want to implement the new type messages that we are going to use. And in this application, we have two types of messages. We have our command messages, and then we have our normal messages. Our command messages are like the get book message that we already have in here. Because it sends out an HTTP request, it's considered what's called a command in Elm, whereas our request books is just a normal message. Because we want a post command and a delete command, we're going to add two new commands, one called setBook and deleteBook. Rather than having a list book inside of them, they're going to have a result HTTP error string, and this is because the return JSON value will be a string type. Then we want to add a postbook message and a deleteBook message that has an integer tied to it. So our deleteBook message will take in the ID, which is an integer. So when we click the button to delete a book, it will take that integer and pass it to our deleteBook command. Our deleteBook will then call a HTTP delete request, which will then delete our book from our database. Because we're going to be working with a form, we need three more messages, one called get title, the other one called get author, and the last one called get published. This will allow us to set the fields in our model from our form. So when a user types in the title, it will get put into the title of our model, and then when the user hits the post button, that title will then be pushed into JSON, which will be pushed into our database. Now, because our setBook command and our deleteBook command would require two cases inside of our update function, we create this helper function to make it so that we only have to write one case. You can see here our helper function takes in our model, our result with an HTTP error and string, and then it outputs a tuple of model and command message. We take in our model and result, and then we match on result. If we get back OK JSON, then we want to update our model error message to an empty string, and then we want to call debug.log and pass in status complete, and this will have no command associated with it. If we get back an error, however, then we'll update our model error message with toString and that error, and so that will go into our error message, and of course no command is attached to this either. And so for our setBook case and our deleteBook case, we just pass in our result and our model to the HTTP book completed function, and so now we don't have to write two separate cases for these two like we did with getBooks. Now it's important to note that we can't put getBooks in here because getBooks is a different type than and result HTTP error string. It's a result HTTP error list of books. So it wouldn't work that way. Next, we want to add our Postbook message. Now this will update our model, the title and the author specifically, and what it's going to do is just make them into empty strings. And it's going to do this because we're going to be passing our title and author into a form, and we want those form values to disappear after the user hits the button. Then on the command side, it's going to call book post command and pass in the model. And this book post command function will be connected to our set book command message, which will fire off the HTTP post method. Our delete book message is sort of similar in that it also has a command function attached to it, and we update the model for our delete book. Specifically, we're updating the books field. We're calling list.filter, and we're going to look for all of the books, and we want to keep all of the books where the ID of the book is not equivalent to the ID that we're passing through. So when we push the button to delete a book, that book will specifically have an ID, and we want that book to be removed from the top layer of our application. So to do that, we run this filter function, which will just remove it. Then we want to delete it from our database, so we call the delete function, which calls our delete book command message. Our get title and get author are fairly simple. Get title updates the model.title with the string that's being passed through, and the same with author. So model.author is equivalent to the string. And then our published takes our published field and it makes it equivalent to the opposite. So if it's false, it will become true, and if it's true, it will become false. And the reason we want that type of functionality is because our published field inside of our form will be a checkbox. So when the box is checked, it will be true, and when it's not checked, it will be false. So now we need to create our book post command function and our delete function, and the functions that go along with these functions. Book post command takes in the model and it outputs a command message, and so our model gets put in, and then we call http.send on set book, and we call another function called add book with our model inside of it. Add book takes in our model and it outputs an HTTP request string. So in this function we use a let in binding. We let URL be HTTP localhost 8000 API version 1 books, and then we say body is equivalent to model piped into our book encoder function that we have to create, which will convert it into JSON, and then we want to say that this is an http.json body type, so we pipe that into that as well. We put this body variable and this URL variable inside of an http.post on the URL with the body, calling a status decoder function that we'll create. Book encoder is what encodes our book into JSON from the form. So it takes in the model and it outputs an encode.value. We call encode.object, and then we want to set the title to encode.string, and specifically we point it at model.title. We do the same for author and for published. For published though, it's encode.boolean, and this is very similar looking to our decoder as well, except we're not using a map function. Instead, we're just creating a new object and then sending it out. Our status decoder function outputs a JSON decoder and a string, and so we just call json.field status, and then we call json.string. So this will look at the JSON that comes back from sending this post request, and it will look specifically at the status, and then it will return that as a string. Now we don't really care about that value, so we're just going to leave it and not actually store it in anything, but you could do a lot of different things with that if you wanted to. Those are all the functions that we need for our post request. Now let's build up our delete request. We want to start with this function delete, which takes in an integer. Now delete takes in our integer and it outputs a command message. In this we use a let in binding. We bind decoder to json.succeed with an empty string because we don't care about the response from our request. And then we bind a to I as a string. And then we want to create a request, so we call http.request, which is a record. Now the reason we're doing this is because there's no http.delete method in Elm. So we have to set up the method ourselves using the http request record. So we set the method to delete, we set the headers to empty, we set the URL to localhost 8000 API version 1 books concatenated with our ID. For A, we've turned our ID into a string. and then we can just concatenate it on the end here. And if you remember with our API, when we deleted a book, we delete it by ID. The rest of this is fairly boilerplate. Our body, we're just going to say http.emptyBody. Then for expect, we want to tell it what kind of stuff to expect, and basically we're passing in our empty string because we don't expect anything. Then for timeout, we're passing in maybe nothing, which essentially means we're probably going to get nothing. And then with credentials, we want to be false because we don't need to authenticate for this particular request. Then we're going to call http.send on our delete book command message with the request inside of it. And that's all we needed to do for our delete request. Now, if you wanted to make like a put request, you would just change this method to put, and you would probably just change the URL so that you could update the book by ID, and you might mess around with a new form and things like that. It's fairly similar to what we've already done here. Alright, so now we want to update our views. Specifically, we want to add a button to our book view, and we want to create a form so that we can actually write in a book and post it. So the button we put in here, we want to be attached to each book. This button will have an on-click event of delete book with the book ID inside of it, and the actual button will look like an X, and this will take the book that it's attached to and just delete it. Then we want to create a book form function, and this will have our form inside of it. This will take in our model and output a HTML message, and this will just have a div which will be of ID of form, and it will have 3 labels and 3 inputs and then a button. The first label will be for title, and it will have text of title. I put 2 spaces between it and I made it capitalized so it should look nicer. Then the input will be ID title type text, and it will specifically reference HTML attributes value model.title. On input will be the get title message. Then our author will be similar, so HTML.attributes value model.author, and on input will be get author. And then our published will be a checkbox, so we'll have label for published, input ID published, type checkbox, on click will be get published. And then our button will be on click post book, which will actually send our post request, and the text of it will be post book. So to just add our form, we just add it below our button for getting the books. We just call book form with the model in it, and that will render this entire component inside of this div. Alright, so here's our application. We can click get books. This will bring all of the books out of our database. You can see there are some new ones here. We can delete these books by clicking the X. So for instance, say I want to delete the Harry Potter book, I can click X and now it's gone. And if I hit get books, it doesn't come back. I can add a new book here by typing in the title and the author, and if the book is published, I can click the box and I can post it. Now notice that after I post it, the form clears, but it doesn't update the get books field. If we click get books though, it will pull the new item out of the database. Now this is because our post book button doesn't automatically fire off the get books message. We could correct this, but it would require a little bit of finesse. It would also require converting all of our HTTP requests into what are called tasks. We may do that at some other point, but for now, we're just going to leave it as it is. Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below. And if you disliked it, then by all means downvote it as much as you like. Have a good day.